to begin with, you, Senior Minister, believe that the coming decade holds a lot of potential for this continent. Tell us why.
So I think some facts are very clear. Africa is going to be potentially the largest source of growth for the world economy for the next 10, 15, 20 years. It will also be a major source of urbanization. So that's an opportunity not just for Africa, it's an opportunity for the world. And it's a world where many other things are slowing down. Asia, too, is a source of growth. So really what we're recognizing is that the two major sources of growth have to now define a type of globalization that's not a zero-sum game where one person loses or one continent loses or one country loses, it's because another one is gaining. It's really a positive-sum game where we can all expand the pie and grow prosperity for our people. And that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to define a type of globalization where we engage with each other and where we can all do better. And I think it's extremely important in today's global climate that we do this. I must say, though, that when we talk about Africa being an opportunity, and a large opportunity, it's also a big risk. It's actually a very big risk, because if we fail in Africa, the consequences are equally large. And if you think of Africa today compared to where, let's say, China was 30 years ago. China 30 years ago was at its peak in terms of the number of young people. China's now getting older. 30 years ago, it was very young. It had a very large number of young people. Africa today has more young people, has 3 times more young people than China did then. 3 times more, much larger. But I do not think Africa is prepared the same way that China was 30 years ago in terms of education and skills. So when we talk about this opportunity of the future, there has to be a sense of urgency. A sense of urgency about providing people with the skills, the opportunities, not just when they're very young, but also when they are the youth and they're entering the workforce. Digital skills, all the opportunities of the future. And if we don't do that, we have a problem that's not just a problem for Africa, we have a global problem. So this is a global opportunity and a global risk.
Indeed. The makeup of the economies of African countries and those in Asia, and particularly Singapore, are vastly different. But what do you think that we can learn from Singapore's development path?
Well, we are a small country, so I wouldn't say that we are a model for anyone else. And Singapore's development path has comprised a process of learning from the rest of the world, adapting solutions, and trying to implement it in Singapore as well as we can. That's what our development is about. It's constant learning. And I would say that learning would not have come about without competition. Singapore had to compete. It had to compete with the world. And because we had to compete with the world, we had to learn as quickly as we could. And there's a way in which that reinforces itself by participating in global markets, in regional and global supply chains. It's just so much learning. So much learning about how to operate machines, how to skill up people, how to make sure that supply chains are efficient. It's constant learning. So competition in the global market has been the greatest gift for Singapore. The fact that we couldn't rely on just doing things internally or something for ourselves, but had to compete in the world market, was the greatest gift we had, because we had to force ourselves to learn as quickly as possible. And that's still what Singapore is today. It's constant learning and adapting, because otherwise someone takes the rug from under us.
Indeed. Let's talk about FinTech for a moment. It's, a big disruptor. And even in a country like Kenya, it's said to be on course to overtake traditional economic drivers. What are your thoughts about the use of FinTech, encouraging, financial inclusion, even of those that may have been traditionally left out of the traditional, finance system?
Well, first, I think it's a big opportunity. President Kenyatta and I had the opportunity to talk to a few of the very impressive new companies and some established companies that are becoming new. I think what's distinctive about FinTech is, unlike manufacturing, where Asia has a big lead over Africa, and Africa is now able to catch up. In FinTech, Africa has a lead over Asia in many areas, and M-Pesa is, of course, a classic example. And by the way, President Kenyatta, now we're just looking at the latest M-Pesa app, which is remarkable. It's a watch meant for the blind, and it allows, through the use of Braille, for the blind to do banking, to be able to save and to be able to receive. Remarkable innovation. So Africa, unlike manufacturing, in FinTech, in my opinion, in payments, as well as a whole range of other bottom of the pyramid and middle of the pyramid applications, Africa's in the lead, and we can learn from each other.
And how can governments promote the benefits of FinTech while still protecting against its potential downsides?
So that's a very important question, and I think it's instructive that this conference was organized not by two tech platform providers, not by any of the FANGs. It was organized by two central banks who are meant to be regulators. And that's instructive because we are going about this in a way which promotes innovation but preserves stability and trust. And that's critical for financial systems. And it means, first and foremost, that we've got to focus our attention on the foundational infrastructure, making sure there's enough competition in the system for our traditional players, because it's competition that FinTech brings, drives down costs, but making sure that the traditional players whom people trust, the retail public especially trusts, they're able to hold their own. And I think the Singapore experience has been very encouraging because our leading traditional banks have now also become leading digital banks. And it happened because they had to compete. So there's a bit of a win-win here, or I would say a sweet spot where FinTech starts off as a disruptor. The traditional players respond to the disruption by doing internal disruption, and you end up with a far more innovative financial system. And as a regulator, we feel comfortable with that. We feel comfortable with the fact that traditional banks have adapted, become more dynamic, and are themselves leading digital players.
As this is the Afro-Asian FinTech Summit and Festival that we're here for the next 2 days, Senior Minister, tell us how you think our two continents can foster closer partnerships, both in public and private sector.
Well, I think, going back to what I said earlier, the world has to be occupied with Africa and engaged with Africa because it's an opportunity and because we cannot afford failure in Africa. And it means that when we talk about cross-border exchange, when we talk about globalization, it can't just be about exchange of goods and services. It has to be an exchange of responsibilities, of techniques, of capabilities, and an exchange of culture. That's what successful globalization is about. It's not just exchange of goods and services and taking advantage of labor cost differentials and doing some arbitrage. That's the surface of globalization. But the inner engine of globalization is about that exchange of techniques, capabilities, and ultimately a sense of responsibility for each other. So we can't just look at each other with curiosity or even respect. We have to engage with each other. And everything we're doing together, with this conference being, I think, a classic example, is about that engagement and learning and capability development. That's the inner engine of globalization. And if we don't focus on that, we end up with a zero-sum game. It just becomes pure labor cost arbitrage.
Senior Minister, my final question. And once we're here, we're engaging today, we're learning, collaborating, networking, what for you would be the one thing, the one outtake that for you would say that this inaugural festival has been a success that we can continue to build on year?
Well, I think the one thing that is different about this festival compared to a traditional conference that you get in banking, finance, innovation, technology, is that this is a festival that involves very energetic, entrepreneurial, and clever people focusing on what people with a little money can do, what people with small amounts of savings can do, small remittances, small loans. It's focusing on what people in the bottom and the middle of society can do. And if you can do that well, it's a whole different wave of innovation. It's not top-down, it's ground-up. And I think what FinTech is doing is it's focusing on a lot of neglected parts of society. And when you look at it globally, that's the mass of humanity. It's ordinary farmers, it's women, it's young people, it's people who otherwise wouldn't have had a chance in a regular conventional system. And it's focusing on opportunity for them. And FinTech, by lowering the costs of starting a savings account, making a remittance payment, obtaining a loan, insuring yourself, being able to get invoice financing.
Right.
It's actually bringing finance to the ordinary person in an affordable way, and we're really leading to a new type of economic growth. And if Africa can take the lead in that, and Asia can take a lead in that, I think the world will be a much better place.
Indeed, it will. Thank you. That's a good place to finish it. Senior Minister Tharman, thank you very much for your time. You may take your seats.